Today's Bible reading is from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 4 to 17. Is Mordecai persuade Esther to help? When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out to the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he could not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her that he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king was about one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. For if you remain silent in this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent his reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather all together the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instruction. God bless his word.
So we're going to be looking at Esther's story today and how she takes some big risks to serve God and her fellow Jewish people. So Esther was someone who faced a big risk but worked within her sphere of influence. And the big risk that she had to take could have cost her not only her position of privilege, but also her life. So when I was taking a ministry formation subject a few years ago, I heard something interesting in a lecture. We were looking at a person's vocation, job, profession, responsibilities, things they do in life, or calling, and discussing the idea that we're primarily called to serve God in whatever life or work circumstances we find ourselves in. We read in 1 Corinthians 7, 20-21, each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. And also in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5-6. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favour when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. And it was in that context that the lecturer presented us with some, I guess you'd call them vocational titles for different biblical characters. There was community leader for Moses, Daniel, and David. There was civic leader for Nehemiah. Bivocational or retail and manufacturing for Paul. And Esther shows up on that list of vocations as a beauty model. And I found it a pretty ironic profession for someone who risked it big for God, but it's pretty accurate. So in Esther 2, verse 7, we read, Esther had a lovely figure and was beautiful. And then in verse 12, we read, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. Now, that's not really my sort of thing. I tend to leave it so long between hair appointments that it's usually a dramatic change of style and colour when I do go. I don't mind a spa day now and then, but that long of beauty treatments as the only thing I was doing would probably bore me silly. Some of you might love it though. But notice that it's her beauty that opens the door for her to be where she was able to be used. So God can use anyone and open doors to influence. Oh, sorry, got a bit behind. So Esther is an unlikely, ordinary candidate. She's not presented as someone who's wise or a leader or ambitious. She wasn't looking to be influential or to take a big step of faith. She was just someone who was beautiful and the king happened to like. She was an orphan. We're told in chapter 2 that she's helpless and at the mercy of extended family caring for her. And she's a woman. Now, I'm not going to say much on that aspect, and just about Esther herself, not gender politics or what the book of Esther might say on that. That's not our focus for now. All I'll say is the context of the book is a patriarchal society. Golden Gay, in his book Old Testament Theology, says of the place of women in that society, and of Esther in particular, women have to work within a system that puts them in a subordinate position, and that makes Esther a useful model for Judites in dispersion because they have to do that. I would also add that with our society heading towards a situation where Christianity is becoming more restricted and unwelcome, it also makes Esther a useful model for us today. So, what enables Esther to take the big risk that was asked of her? When Esther first comes on the scene, we see that she's being guided by others. Chapter 2, verse 10 tells us that she follows her cousin's instructions not to reveal her nationality. And verse 15 tells us that she defers to Haggai's guidance on what to take when she goes for her introduction to the king. So she submits to and learns from those more experienced. In verse 19, we're told that she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions. We're not told anything about how she might have felt about that or what she might have been thinking. The only picture we're given is that she appears to be a dutiful person who submits to her situation and to the advice she's given by others when she's learning about this new context that she's found herself in. In chapter 3, we see the development of a plot to destroy the Jews. A brief outline is that Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, who's a noble that the king had ordered people to bow down and honour. Haman is told, and his rage drives him to plot not just to take care of Mordecai, but to wipe out all of the Jews. A law was passed ordering that all the Jews be destroyed on a certain date. So we see the action of one man has endangered all the Jews living in Persia. And we heard in chapter 4 that was read earlier for us that Mordecai was overcome when he hears this. He puts on sackcloth and ashes. And this is the point where we see Esther's character start to develop. It's the first time we see her choosing an action, and it leaves a little to be desired. She originally responds to Mordecai's problem by sending him some new clothes. Some people suggest that she's trying to solve the problem by improving appearances. And that might be a fitting interpretation given that she's in a situation where appearances have enabled her to get the position that she's in, and that's what she knows. But I'd speculate that maybe she was trying to offer Mordecai a way to enter into a space where he'd be able to deal with the problem. We see in chapter 4, verse 2, that Mordecai has only gone as far as the king's gate, and that's because it's against the law to enter while in sackcloth. And that's ironic, because the reason we're given in chapter 3 for the destruction of the Jewish people is they don't obey the king's laws. It brings us to another point. She doesn't take mistakes to heart. Further on, we're told in chapter 4, verse 6, that she sends the eunuch out to speak with Mordecai on her behalf. Maybe she's failed to understand the significance of the situation and was just trying to make interaction and problem solving easier. Either way, her first try wasn't the best course of action, but she tried again and sent out her servants to talk to Mordecai. So Mordecai then tells Esther all that happened through the servant that she sends. Mordecai again gives Esther an instruction and tells her to go to the king and beg for his mercy to her people. But at this point, she acknowledges the risk and her fear. She hasn't blindly followed what she's been asked. So both Mordecai and Esther knew what the outcome might be, and Esther questions the instruction given by her cousin. In verse 11, she says, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." So it seems that Esther might be doubting her standing before the king. He was enamored with her, but was her position ever strong enough that she could have confidence that he would be receptive to her unrequested approach? We don't know, but we do know that Esther knows both the law that she's referred to and also the recent history of the king's favour towards the former queen, not sparing her from the consequences when she displeased him. You can see chapter 1 for that. Her cousin responds by pointing out that she's at risk either way, as is her family and the wider community. He adds that the possibility that her place has been given to her for this time. He also adds that he's confident that the Jews will be saved either way, but that her and her family might miss out and bear the consequences if she fails to do her duty and act. So she allows others to speak into her circumstances and decisions. She takes on board what Mordecai has to say, as she has the guidance of her cousin up to this point, and she really steps up. And I think that it's the belief that there's a bigger picture and storyline at work that enables Esther to really be courageous and take on the risk that's being asked of her. And often when we're in the midst of a challenging situation, we need others to remind us of the big picture, which can be hard to see beyond what we're facing. And she doesn't do it alone. So in chapter 4, verses 15 to 17, we see she's no longer being instructed by her cousin. She makes a plan and she asks others to stand alongside her. She actually gives him instructions at that point to gather all the community and fast from food and drink for 3 days, and her attendants will do the same. Her cousin, we're told, carries out all her instructions. So she's beginning to lead others rather than follow, and she's supported in that by those around her. But she doesn't act impulsively or rashly. So Esther shows great wisdom and restraint in how she goes about her task. We've already seen in chapter 4 that she doesn't rush into the action, she takes time to prepare. Let's read chapter 5, verses 1 to 3. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." We see that she pleases the king and he allows her to enter. But more than that, we see that he says that her request will be granted, even up to half the kingdom. But she doesn't ask. She sticks with her plan, and she has the king and Haman come to a private banquet. And this is repeated again when at the first banquet, the king again asks what she wants. And she has them come to another banquet, and she'll then make her request. So I don't know about you, but after the risk of just showing up, being allowed to enter, and having the king say, "Your request will be granted," it'd be a big temptation to just jump in and ask. But Esther resists, and she holds to a deliberate, patient approach. Why? We're not told how she came to her decision or the plan that she came up with. But we see in chapter 1 that the previous queen loses her place because of a perceived humiliation of the king, and his advisors had feared that it might translate into other wives also refusing the requests of their husbands, so not following the societal system. And I think Esther might have been bordering similar territory by having approached the king in the first place. And it would have been humiliating and disrespectful for her to reveal in a public setting that she was a Jew and the king had inadvertently risked her life. By inviting the king and Haman to a private banquet, she showed respect for their positions and authority, and she honoured the king despite his bad decision. Golden Gay also has this to say: "As a woman, she may be in the same position of power as a man, even a position of greater power, but the kind of power she exercises may be different from the kind that men more characteristically exercise." So Esther exhibits wisdom in seeing a way to exercise her power within the system. She was bold enough to step out of bounds initially, but then she seeks to not offend while still working to change the circumstances. I think everyone, but especially young people, can learn from this. Even if a system is broken and needs to change, there are ways to work that will be more effective than others. A combative approach rarely goes well. You've heard the saying, "You catch more flies with honey than vinegar," and it really is true. Okay, so I want to go back and look at a couple of things that are important when we think about how God guides. This book is interesting in that God isn't mentioned at all. There's only vague references to religious practices. In chapter 3, verse 8, we're told their customs are different. Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes to mourn, and Esther asks for fasting in preparation for what she's to do. We're not given any information about what the time of fasting and preparation looked like for Esther or for the others. There's no prayers recorded. However, the original readers would have understood fasting as an appeal to God and would likely have seen prayer implied. Why aren't we given any details? Well, I think it might be to teach us something about God's guidance. God often guides through circumstances and our knowledge of him. We see Mordecai pose a question of Esther rather than a statement when he says that she might have been placed in the situation for this. It's not a divine revelation that Esther is God's chosen person to act. It's obvious from the text that Esther had a plan, but we're not told anything about how it came to be. We haven't seen direct instructions from God, but we do see that both Esther and Mordecai know that the right thing to do is act on behalf of those who have no chance of saving themselves. They know that God will save his people one way or another, and in the absence of God speaking directly, they can rely on what they know of God and what God has taught his people throughout history to make an informed decision. A friend sent me a devotional a while back, and a little snippet is fitting here. It said, "It should be unnecessary to be constantly saying, 'Oh Lord, direct me in this and in that.' Of course he will, and in fact, he is doing it already. If our everyday decisions are not according to his will, he will press through them, bringing restraint to our spirit." There are times when we can just act on something or make a decision, trusting that God can and will step in to change our course if he needs to. And Golden Gain, summing up the Esther story, says, "God's intervention is implied but veiled. The narrative pushes the reader to see God behind Esther's story and behind her own, but they choose whether or not to do so. Their story would not work without the exercise of faith expressed in fasting, crying, and hoping. It would not work without the exercise of human responsibility, and it would not work without the coincidences. In the absence of supernatural revelation of the kind God gave Moses, Mordecai and Esther are more illuminating models for the believing politician than Moses and Aaron." Throughout the Bible, we see that God uses unlikely people who feel like they're not qualified or prepared, and he asks them to trust him and take big personal risks for his glory and the good of his people. Some of those people, like Moses, Paul, and Philip, had direct supernatural encounters where God appears or speaks directly to them and gives them specific instructions. The others step out and take big personal risks based on what they know of God and how they are to live as his people, like Nehemiah, Esther, and Barnabas. We as Western Christians don't live with the reality that our lives are at stake to stand up and be counted on matters of faith, acting ethically, stepping in for others who are being taken advantage of, or sharing the gospel, at least not currently. A time might come when that begins to happen, but we're not there yet. We can still take big risks in serving God, though. Are we willing to speak up when there's injustice happening in our workplace, even if it might cost us our job? Are we willing to lovingly challenge cultural norms that go against the way God intends us to live, even if it will make us unpopular? Are we willing to share about our faith and the hope God offers when the opportunity comes up, even if it might make us uncomfortable or might change how people see us? And how will we prepare ourselves to be ready to take on those risks when the time comes? We don't have to think that we're ready or be wanting opportunities for God to present them to us. I'd like to encourage the youth and young adults especially to think about finding a mentor. If you know the career direction you want to head in, you could look for a Christian in that field or something similar and ask them to be your mentor and begin talking with them about how their faith impacts different areas of their work. Start looking at where the challenges might be and thinking through the work culture or system and how to work through living out your faith in that context. Work's not our only sphere of influence, though. We can be involved in all sorts of community activities and all sorts of family situations. And we can be looking for people that we can connect with to help us think about how to live out our faith and influence in that sphere. If you're involved in sport, you could seek out another Christian to guide you in how to live your faith in that context. If you're a new parent, is there someone further along the journey that has wisdom to share that can pray for you and walk alongside you? But don't burden yourself thinking that you need to have a mentor for every area of your life or work on everything at once. Think about what's most challenging for you and look for someone in that area that can help you. And it doesn't always have to be someone older or someone that's walked the same journey. Especially for those who are getting older and facing those challenges, there might not always be someone further along the journey who is still here or able to share their wisdom with you. But there's people with knowledge and understanding of the situations and the grief that can come with that, or those who are in the same stage that can walk alongside you. So, who is there that you can ask to help you build the kind of character that's able to take big risks that God might ask of you at any given moment. Be on the lookout for them, and be on the lookout for someone that you can share your wisdom and experience with. Remember, it's not wise to fly solo. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that you've placed us in a community of your people. I pray that you would help us all to be thinking about how our faith impacts the different areas of our life and where the challenges are. I pray that you would help us to connect with people that can help us walk on that journey. And I pray that you give us wisdom to be deliberate and patient in how we approach challenging situations. We pray this in your name. Amen.